I am so excited to be here with all of you. And so I have about like a 15, 20-minute just spiel, which will kind of give a sketch of the book for those who haven't read it and kind of, bless you, and introduce you to some of the big ideas in it. And along the way, I'll kind of also talk about just what folks have found interesting about the book so far in its reception. Okay, so this is the cover. I've been working on this book for like 10 plus years. And so this is a culmination of a lot of work. And Alex is someone I met in graduate school. And so, has really been with me and seen this project develop like since I was a baby philosopher. So, yes. Baby philosopher, yes. Okay, so the book's organizing question is this: when and why is it wrong to stereotype? And this is a classic kind of project in ethics. So I'm a philosopher. And so, in philosophical ethics, there's this thing called an explanatory project. This is something that Sarah Stroud has kind of dubbed like a certain kind of philosophical kind of project you can have. So it's like a recipe, to like have a project like this. You start by selecting a phenomenon that people typically or always assume is wrongful. So in this case, stereotyping. And then you subject that presumption of wrongness to scrutiny. You ask why. Is it always wrong or only sometimes wrong? If you find it's only sometimes wrong, then the challenge is to really explain what differentiates the wrongful cases from the ones that aren't wrongful. If you conclude that it is, in fact, always wrongful, you vindicate the presumption. There's still competing explanations about why the thing is wrong. So it's to get to like a deeper understanding about the nature of this phenomenon that we presume to be wrong. So it's kind of like a kind of a deep dive, a deep ethical investigation into a phenomenon. So once you've selected your phenomenon, then the next step is to kind of offer a characterization of it. And Stroud says, well, you should start with like an uncontroversial definition of the thing you're trying to understand. The problem with stereotyping is that there is basically no uncontroversial place to start. And so in my case, what I do instead, and one contribution of the book, is to kind of give a little sketch of the term's history. And so this, my friends, is the rotary printing press, right? This was a invention in the early 19th century, and stereotypes were basically a solution to a design problem with this press. Previous to the rotary printing press, there was this thing called the hand press. And so it worked like this, going boop, boop, yes. And you had to create like a stamp for it if you wanted to like do a book, like for every page of text. So you had to like letter by letter, like assemble the page and kind of lock it into place. And then you put it in the press, and then the press just went to work. With the rotary press, those old plates that had been in use for over 400 years would not work anymore, because as you can see, there's a cylinder in it. You need something that's curved. And so printers had to figure out, well, how can we do this? And this is the kind of OG stereotype. It's a stereotype plate. And basically, there was like a piece of paper mache that was put down over these sort of old style plates to create an impression of it. And you kind of had to have a team of people kind of pressing down on this paper mache, and then you could actually curve it. Once it was curved, then you cast it in metal. And so you had the perfectly kind of designed, you could do it just to the specifications, but in any case, once you had these plates made, these rotary presses really automated printing in a way you could produce more, you could produce faster. And from the early 1820s until, in 1978 was the last day that the New York Times stopped using stereotypes to print their newspaper every day. So until then, every single day, the newspaper, they employed stereotypers, and they created these plates for the daily news. So for over 150 years, this was like, cutting cutting-edge printing technology. And so from the very beginning, stereotypes were associated with automation, and they were a technology. Okay? So throughout the 19th century, the term started to migrate from referring to the plates to the images that produced by them, the images and ideas. So this is a stereotyped image. And there's a connection, of course, between it was originally called stereotyped image because stereotypes were used to produce it. But then these sort of images sort of got detached from the kind of process. So any kind of generic image was a stereotype. And there was this kind of connection between stereotyped images and taxonomy. So stereotypes in particular were associated with kinds. They were kind of images of kinds. So this is like European man and woman. It's an era where naturalists are coming up with taxonomies of different kind of animals in the animal kingdom, and sociologists are talking about different social types. And so stereotype becomes kind of fixed to this sort of kind of generic kind of image. And interestingly, the word, and does anyone know the word in French for stereotype? Anyone remember? Oh, my partner in the back just raised his hand. Yeah, great. No, it's cliché. It's cliché. So this idea of like genericness, of like common, like cliché, like it's just not original. But notice what you don't have yet in these sort of 19th century understanding. You don't have the idea that stereotypes are false, that they're distorted, that they're like inherently morally bad. You just have this idea of genericness and that they're kind of cheap. They're like a cheap way to produce like a lot of images, okay? You also don't have yet the idea that we have stereotypes in our head. You had to wait until kind of the early 20th century. Walter Lippmann was a student of William James, a famous Harvard philosopher and kind of one of the founders of psychology as a discipline. And Lippmann, studying with James, kind of had this idea that humans have things like stereotype plates in our heads. And we use them to kind of perceive the world, to create order. And Lippmann associated stereotypes with categories and concepts. So again, it's this kind of genericness, this typeness. That's really the kind of notion that Lippmann is deploying. All right, and you have to wait until kind of mid-century after World War II until this is a book called The Nature of Prejudice by sociologist Gordon Allport. He also had there's like a strong psychological kind of research program in here too. Allport argued that stereotypes were inherently false and distorted images. So you see in this era, so psychologists are thinking about World War II, the Holocaust, decades of kind of lynchings in the United States. They're like, how did these things happen? Well, part of the answer is stereotypes and kind of their connection to prejudice. So starting in this time, you get more of this pejorative notion of stereotypes. And nowadays, though, we are swinging with kind of in the algorithmic kind of era. Algorithms can stereotype, and they have stereotypes. So again, you're seeing this idea that stereotypes are literally part of machines, and they're a kind of technology. So we're kind of swinging back to kind of the old kind of notion of what a stereotype is. But okay, so when and why is it wrong to stereotype? So my friends, I guess you can see my conundrum now. There is like a lot of different things that fall under the heading of stereotype. And so part of what I argue in the book is that we should kind of return to kind of these older notions of stereotype as a kind of generalization. And even though, we had the sort of the pejorative notion is kind of, I think, most entrenched in people's minds, still this sort of older kind of generalizing notion has been around in linguistics with this idea of generics, and also in psychology, where psychologists associate stereotypes with concepts or a formation and use of them. So it's sort of like I think there's a basis for this kind of generalizing notion in the sciences and in history. So the working definitions of the term I give is this: to stereotype a group is to characterize that group as a collective entity, and to stereotype an individual is to judge that person by group membership. So stereotyping is a kind of generalization. So the first chapter of the book, I kind of like lay out what is a stereotype? What is stereotyping? And in the second chapter, I introduce what has, I don't know, kind of become a very controversial element of this book, which is the idea that stereotyping constitutes a form of discrimination. So, but it's in a very thin sense. It's the idea that whether it's this thing we're doing in our head, judging people, or whether it's sort of these images and ideas in the world, there's a stereotype involves kind of kind-based distinctions or differentiations, discriminations in this sort of like the older sense of like discriminating judgment. Okay. So just a visual of the puzzle. So judging persons by group membership, that's kind of stereotyping individuals in a kind of very thin sense. And the puzzle of the book is, my big anyway, that's my technology, my little zoom in here. What makes the wrong cases special? Like if stereotyping is a form of generalizing, when is it wrongful? When and why is it wrongful? And so is there one thing that the wrongful cases have in common? Are there two things? Is it even messier than that? And of course, I argue that it is a lot messier than just one or two things. And that's part of the contribution of the book. And just one little thing to mention here. For folks who have a pejorative notion, who want to keep stereotype as like the bad or wrong kind of generalizing, I'm like totally fine with that. And so what I say in a certain way is, if you want to use the stereotype for the wrongful cases exclusively, that's totally fine. You can still get on board with the book project because there's still this puzzle about how the wrongful cases differ from mere generalizing. Okay. When I start looking at hypotheses about what's wrong with stereotyping, I use standpoint theory. That's sort of my methodology. And one of the core ideas of standpoint theory is kind of really nicely expressed in this quote by Du Bois. Du Bois says in Dark Water, in the last analysis, only the sufferer knows the root of his own suffering. So it's the idea that people persistently targeted for wrongful stereotyping have some insight into how they've been wronged. So you want to start with the people who have the most everyday experience with this sort of wrongful stereotyping and kind of figure out what they're saying about when and why it has wronged them. The standpoint theory has like another piece to it, which is that just being targeted for wrongful stereotyping doesn't automatically give you knowledge of what's going on. You have to kind of work for that understanding. And so in particular, I look at activists in liberation movements across the 20th century who've had things to say about what's wrong with stereotyping, who've thought a lot about and offered an analysis of it. And so that's kind of, what kind of is the analysis is really rooted in. So is there a wrong of stereotyping? Chapters kind of 4 through 7, in each chapter, I kind of look at a hypothesis that's sort of rooted in a specific liberation movement. That's Barbara Getting. She's a lesbian activist. She's holding a sign that says homosexuals should be judged as individuals. So chapter 4 is about the idea that's what's wrong with stereotyping is that it fails to treat people as individuals because you like generalize them. So you're not like treating them as individuals. So I look at kind of the gay rights movement and how they use this objection and to see if this could be what the wrong of stereotyping. Chapter 5, I look at prejudice-focused objections to stereotyping, and I use early AIDS activism in the United States to kind of think about this objection. After these 2 chapters, I kind of abandoned the idea that there could just be one thing wrong with stereotyping. Even you can see the motivation for this even in this kind of poster, which is from the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. It says, AIDS attacks the body, prejudice attacks the spirit. One is caused by a virus, one is caused by ignorance, both can kill. So prejudice, can be intrinsically in itself wrong, right, if you have these prejudice judgments. But notice the downstream consequences that the activists are pointing out, that these prejudices, in addition to being like problematic in themselves, actually kill people, right? And so next chapters sort of look at kind of accounts that are what I call modestly pluralistic. Instead of saying one thing is wrong with stereotyping, they say there are two things wrong with stereotyping. And this chapter is sort of, I'm thinking about the idea that stereotyping could be wrong when it's either disrespectful or harmful. And kind of going back to this idea that stereotyping is a form of discrimination, analytic philosophy has a very well-developed, this is discrimination theory. And so there are all these theories about when and why discrimination is wrong. So one of the most popular theories is that discrimination is wrong when it's disrespectful or harmful. So in effect, I kind of bring kind of the contributors to Bridge who are thinking about all these different ways in which stereotyping harms them and disrespects them into conversations in analytic philosophy and discrimination theory. And the last chapter is about Du Bois and his idea that what's wrong with stereotyping is that it fails to treat people as equals and undermines their freedom. So none of these theories, I argue, can do all the work that we need a theory of wrongful stereotyping to do. Some of them kind of miss cases of wrongful stereotyping. Others cover more cases, but they're not offering the full explanation. And so with standpoint theory, kind of you get this idea that each of these objections is capturing something very important about what's wrong with stereotyping, but none of them is doing the whole work. So I kind of end up at the end of this book with like all of these wrongs, like what to do with this. And I had not worked it out in advance either. I was like, I know stereotyping is wrong for a lot of reasons. And this is kind of what standpoint is suggesting. And so there's a question about how to model this very complex, messy situation. In analytic discrimination theory, there was like basically no options available. There were no options available to me because all of the theories are either unified or they're modestly pluralistic. They said that one or two things are wrong with discrimination, period. And so it's kind of a bit of a puzzle for me. And in wider ethics also, like a lot of the theories are pretty neat and tidy. So I needed to develop other ways of understanding what could be going on here. So here's just like a little slide. So I couldn't use unified theories. That would be an example of a unified theory, which just identifies one thing wrong. I also couldn't use a modestly pluralistic theory, like the disrespect or harm theory. So at the other end of the spectrum, if you go full messy, is particularism, which would say stereotyping when it's wrong, like each case is its own special snowflake. You know, you just need to it's very, very specific. So you look at the context, you look at any who's done it. But the idea here is that there would be no reliable generalizations to be made. But that's also not what I found when I looked across liberation movements. I found these activists invoking the same set of objections time and again across different intersectional groups, across time and place. And so this was not going to do, because there were generalizations you could make. There were patterns. So what I'm really interested in kind of at the nerdiest kind of level theoretically is trying to kind of understand this kind of space in the spectrum. Kind of, are there any ways to model complexity and ethics that are sort of between these two poles? So here was my best attempt. And I found that it actually works pretty well. I used a cluster theory. So this is a little bit extra, but it kind of visualizes. So if the idea would be the wrongs, kind of disrespect and harm and failing to treat people as individuals, they're actually connected to each other probabilistically and causally. So like think about the idea that you can wrong someone by disrespecting them if you have a demeaning belief about the group that they belong to. So that's one element of the disrespect. You have a demeaning belief about the group, and then you apply it to them. Well, that's about beliefs, you know, in your head. So your disrespect, so that's where the wrong is residing. But because humans are like really bad at keeping our thoughts to ourselves. We can't like stuff them inside. They leak out everywhere, even when we don't want them to. But often we'll act on them. So if you have sort of disrespect because you have these demeaning beliefs when you're encountering kind of people who are unlike you, you're likely to act in ways that cause harm. So then you have the harm-based objections. And those harmful ways of acting are actually hooked up with wider patterns of subordination in these wrongful cases. And so then you have the failing to treat people as equals thing. So you can see that there are all these connections. So that was kind of the thought. And so this was a cluster theory. And cluster theories have a long history. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein. So to use the cluster theory, you need the idea of a paradigm case. So Wittgenstein, you have a paradigm case of a game, right? And then so for board games, then you kind of get the cluster of properties by kind of looking at like what the properties that paradigm case has. And then you identify things as board games based on how similar they are to that paradigm. Okay. So cluster theories have been used for names. They've been used for social kinds. So Ron Mallon has a theory, used to have a theory that social kinds like race, gender, and so on were cluster kinds. Matt Andler has like a view of masculinities that they're cluster kinds. But the most famous kind of cluster kinds are all in philosophy of biology. And these are Darwin's finches. And so one cool thing that I like about the cluster as it applies to wrongful stereotyping is you can see these finches have different, they have family resemblance, but they've got different properties, different clusters, because the beaks are different. Why are the beaks different? Well, Darwin said, these birds are living in different environments, and these beaks are functional for them. They help them survive given the kind of food in the environment. And so cluster theories often say that with biological kinds that the clusters of properties are in part explained by the environment that the beings are living in. And so with stereotyping, it's pretty clear that social environments support these wrong-making properties because wrongful stereotyping actually is functional in that it's serving a purpose in a social environment to kind of prop up the power of dominant groups and subordinate other people. So this theory kind of lets you not just kind of see that there's this sort of messy reality where all these properties are kind of traveling together, they're showing up together, but also it gives you a way of explaining how they relate to social environments and to norms and institutions and laws and so on. So the last thing I'll say, you kind of are getting like the vibe of this theory, but another cool thing about cluster theory is that it allows you to talk about different species of wrongful stereotyping. So in the book, ultimately, what I observe is that I'm exploring oppressive stereotyping in the book and the cluster of wrongs associated with that specific form, which I think is the paradigmatic form of wrongful stereotyping. But the theory kind of lets you say that there are other kinds of wrongful stereotyping. This one on the left says resistant to oppression, but wrongful. So James Baldwin has these sort of cases in Fire Next Time of basically Nation of Islam radicals stereotyping white people as devils. And he identifies this as wrongful stereotyping, even though it is clearly kind of a prophylactic or protection against the harms of white supremacy. Nonetheless, he thinks because the stereotype is basically saying white people are intrinsically evil. And he's like, well, what about my friend Mary? She's like real woke and like, she hasn't done all these like bad things. And they're like, no, like it's all white people, just like it's this thing you can never escape it. It's supposed to be intrinsic. So anyway, it's a very specific case that is really loaded. And Baldwin says, well, that's just racist. It's racist. and it's wrong. And he gives an account of why it's wrong. And then there are these sort of other really interesting cases. That's this Katie Creel, if we bring it back to kind of algorithmic and kind of stereotyping. It says socially regulative but unrelated to impression. So Creel gives the example of name-based stereotyping. So if you are named Donald or Elon, and you submit your job resume to you're want to get a job at a grocery store, the algorithm will rate you lower in collegiality because of the data set it's been trained on. And so because the same algorithms are being used across grocery stores, basically you cannot get a job. So this is the idea that, and there are other examples like night owls. There's stereotypes about night owls that the people have argued that you can wrongfully stereotype someone as lazy because they're up all night, etc. Anyway, but the interesting thing about cluster theory is it can admit that there could be other kinds of wrongful stereotyping. But just like with these birds, with the different clusters of properties, it says that oppressive stereotyping is going to be the central case, first of all, and it's going to be the most wrong of all of these cases. It's going to have the largest cluster of wrong-making properties. Whereas these other cases, yeah, they might be wrong, but they're not going to have the same weight to them morally because they're not going to be wrong for as many reasons. So for example, Nation of Islam leadership didn't have the power to really hurt white people with their stereotype because they lack social power. So anyway, this is just a little sketch of kind of the theory and where it's going, and just that it's really leaning into taxonomy once again. And it also gives you kind of resources to break down oppressive stereotyping into in different ways. You can use intersectional principles to kind of pick out different forms of oppressive stereotyping. You could use other principles. So for example, Miranda Fricker has this idea of testimonial injustice. And there's supposed to be different kinds of testimonial injustice. You can have medical testimonial injustice or educational testimonial injustice, which is happening in an educational context. And interestingly, when you kind of look into theorists who are moving in this space, what they actually do is offer you clusters of different properties that are associated with these different forms of injustice. So I think actually the cluster theory is kind of tracking something that a bunch of ethicists are already doing, but it hasn't been explicitly thematized as such. So anyway, that's another kind of cool thing about the theory, and that's all I will have to say for right now. Thank you.